Chapter 1: Desperation and Stupidity. Chapter text. Maybe he shouldn't be doing this on his bedroom floor. Izuku Midoriya glanced up at the digital clock on his computer screen. The bright green letters shone in the darkness of the room. 2:02 a.m. The only other light in the room was the 4 shrine candles he'd bought 3 weeks ago. God, he couldn't believe he was actually trying this. But at this point, he was desperate. The UA entrance exam was in 10 months, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get into shape. The gyms near his apartment had turned him away because of his quirklessness. He wanted to be angry at that, but things like that had just become so normal at this point in his life. He knew it shouldn't be. He shouldn't be used to being treated the way he was, but after so long, he just almost stopped caring. This was the way his life had always been. He honestly couldn't remember a time when people didn't look at him with pity or disgust. But if he didn't care, then why was he trying this? He looked down at the drying paint and candles. He was trying this because he'd exhausted every other choice. He'd even tried cleaning up that polluted beach. His mom wasn't too happy with the torn rotator cuff he'd gotten from that and had promptly forbidden him from continuing. Not that he could if he wanted to. He hadn't been able to lift his arm above his head since he'd injured it. So yeah, this was his last option. Not that he actually expected it to work. He sat back on his heels and grabbed his phone. The instructions on the shady website were surprisingly precise, and the materials were pretty cheap. Paint, twine, candles, and a worthy sacrifice. Whatever that was. The site just said it'd depend on who answered him. He hoped the Katsudon was enough. He didn't really have anything else. Well, aside from his soul, that is. Alright, enough dilly-dallying. He grabbed the lighter with a faintly trembling hand. Not from fear or anything. He didn't actually believe in any of this stuff. The trembling had just become an instinct around fire. One by one, he lit the candles. A different color representing different elements. He had a 5th candle by his side that remained unlit, just like the instructions told him. First red, then yellow, then blue, and finally green. He took a steadying breath before moving the last candle in front of his kneeling form. Purple. He placed the lighter down quickly and grabbed his knife. Alright, here was the difficult part. He slowly, painstakingly carved the kanji into the wax. Power. Strength. Confidence. Hope. He hesitated before adding the last one. It was a spur of the moment, impulsive, the complete antithesis of what he was. He gripped the knife's handle tightly before placing the blade back against the wax. It wouldn't change anything, right? It was just one more character. Sure, the instructions only said one for each element, but it wouldn't change the effect, right? Okay, he swallowed down his anxiety to the next part. Compared to the carving and painting, this part was the hardest. He wiped the blade off with a rag damp with alcohol. The flames of the burning candles reflected off the steel. He forced his hand to still as he rolled up his sleeve and pressed the knife against the flesh of his forearm. Slowly, he dug the blade into his skin and began to carve the first character. Growling groans of pain left his lips as he continued. He hoped his mom didn't come home early. He couldn't gag himself or silence his pain. It was all part of the ritual. Finally, after 5 long minutes, the first character was done. He dropped the knife and dizzily sat back on his heels. He didn't know when he'd hunched over. He gave himself a minute before reaching for the red candle. The flame flickered merrily, and he let his sleep-deprived, pain-fogged mind admire the dancing shadows. He shook his head and immediately regretted it as a wave of dizziness caused him to tilt to the side. Shakily, he raised his bleeding arm above the candle and let the blood drip into the flame. It flickered wildly but miraculously stayed lit. He sighed in relief when the little divot he'd carved into the candle was filled and placed the candle back in its spot. He whimpered as he grabbed the knife again and began with much less hesitance to carve the next character into his skin. This time he filled the yellow candle. Over and over he did this, carving the characters into his arm like tattoos before bleeding into the candles. By the 4th candle, His skin had turned an ashy gray and the blue of his veins stuck out against his skin. He hadn't known a person could bleed so much. Drops of blood had stained the wood of his floor. Oh well, he'd just have to cover those with his rug too. Finally, he turned to the last candle. God, he was regretting adding the last character. With steady hands, how were his hands so steady? He began to carve the last character into his arm. Everything seemed to come into startling clarity as he finished the last symbol. He stared at the broken and bleeding skin for a moment before dropping the knife and reaching out beside him for his bowl. The mortar bowl already had the pine oil in it, now he just had to add the blood and mix it. So that was what he did. He let the blood drip into the bowl in an almost detached sort of way. Then he grabbed his bandages and carefully wrapped the cuts. He took a moment just sitting there. He outright groaned when he realized he'd forgotten to wrap the purple candle in twine. With a sigh, he snatched up the ball of brown twine and grabbed the candle. He coiled the twine around the wax painstakingly, hoping his mistake wouldn't mess up the ritual. Small, bloody fingerprints stained the wax and twine before he finished. He was almost to the good part now. He picked his bowl of blood and oil back up and slowly poured the mixture onto the candle. The bloody mixture pooled in the divot around the wick before overflowing, following along the twine. It dripped and flowed down the candle, seeping into the characters one by one. Power. Strength. Confidence. Hope. Defiance. Chapter 2. Task failed successfully. He set the blood-soaked candle in its place in the painted circle. God, he hoped this worked. He didn't really know what he'd do if it didn't. He doubted he could pass the entrance exam like he was. He took a long breath and stared at his handiwork. A large circle was painted on his floor where his All Might rug had been. This was such a stupid idea. How'd he even come up with this? Well, he knew how he'd come up with it, but really? He'd always thought he was at least somewhat intelligent. The last hour had proven him thoroughly wrong. Yesterday one of Kakin's friends had been heckling him, like usual, and bringing up what Kakin had said the day before when the other delinquent spoke up. A swan dive off a roof? He'd be better off making a deal with the devil. And Izuku had paused for a minute cause, well, that was an idea he hadn't thought of. If there were quirks that could show the user someone's soul or manifest someone's soul, then what else could there be in the world? He guessed he was about to find out. He picked up his lighter again for the final time and lit the purple candle. The wick instantly caught fire, igniting the oil blood mixture. A burst of heat came from the candle as the entire top was engulfed by fire. For a second, he panicked, thinking he'd added too much oil to the mix before the fire died down. The flame seemed to pulse, but he couldn't be sure that wasn't just the blood loss getting to him. Then the flame started spreading, slowly creeping down the spiraling twine. It slowly engulfed the twine and spread to the first character. The kanji for power lit up bright and the flame of the red candle climbed. Izuku watched the flame flicker higher and higher. Sweltering heat suffused the room and sweat trailed down his spine. He definitely hadn't imagined that. This was working. It was actually working. He leaned forward in excitement. The flame moved from the burning kanji of power, slowly spiraling to the next one. Strength lit up with the same fiery display that power had, and the yellow candle surged upward. It felt like the air was drawn from his lungs. The heat mixed with a surge of airflow that churned the stagnant air in the room. Izuku leaned his head back and breathed. It was like he'd never been able to breathe in his life. Like he'd always been on the edge of drowning, and finally, he was getting a real breath of air. It filled his lungs and made him sit up taller. The fog from the blood loss faded, replaced by startling clarity. The flame crawled along and engulfed confidence. The blue candle flame rose alongside the others and the heat in the room vanished under a swell of cooling energy. It felt like he was standing on a cliff, sea spray fanning his face, the smell of salt in his lungs. He could feel his heart beating in his chest, feel the blood in his veins. Every doubt he'd had about the ritual faded. His anxiety drowned. The flame moved on to the next kanji, and this one rushed into him like a surge of everything he'd ever wanted in life. It felt like a blanket was being laid over his shoulders. He swore he could feel hands brushing over his skin, warm and soft. Felt like nothing would ever be able to hurt him. Tears dripped from his nose as he hunched over, head touching the floor as he suffocated in a feeling he'd never truly experienced. Then the powerful presence backed off and he wanted to chase after it. Where was it going? He didn't want it to leave. He needed it. Please don't. The flame engulfed defiance, and every ounce of air in his lungs was sucked out. The gravity in the room came crashing down on him. His body was pressed into the unforgiving hardwood floor, and the only thing he was able to see was the burning purple candle. Fire traced the kanji. The kanji for defiance burned gold, and the fire continued to spread down the twine to the flammable paint he'd mixed with pine oil. The paint ignited, and a glowing pentagram filled with unerringly accurate symbols was traced in flame across the floor, before abruptly surging upward and instantly dying. Each candle was snuffed out at once, leaving the room in almost total darkness. The pressure left the room, and Izuku pulled himself back onto his knees with a whimper. His entire body throbbed. Had it worked? It had to have. With all that had happened, there was no way it hadn't. He pulled his head up to look at the circle and promptly let out a shriek. He scuttled back, chest heaving. Smoke curled within the circle, and within it stood a person. They only barely fit in the circle. Shadow dripped from them like water, pooling at the edge of the pentagram. Their skin was blacker than anything he'd ever seen before. It was like looking into a black hole. All light was sucked into their body and nothing came out. Molten gold eyes stared down at him imperiously. "And who would you be?" Their voice was a purr that sent a shiver down his spine. He'd never felt this kind of presence before. It was oppressive and dominating. It felt like every atom in his body was shaking in fear. This was worse than anything Kaken could ever do to him. Well, its golden eyes narrowed, and he felt the pressure in the room skyrocket. He ducked his head, hunching his shoulders, and stuttered out a reply. "I am Izuku Midoriya, and I want to make a deal with you." There was silence in the room, but the pressure finally let up. He rose his head slightly, grimacing all the while. A litany of "please don't hurt me" ran through his head on repeat. The demon creature god thing stared down at him with bored eyes. Yes, well, that's rather obvious. Not really much other reason to summon a demon. The creature demon sighed deeply, its whole being radiating both annoyance and longing. Izuku rose from his hunched position slowly. Maybe this wasn't such a bad idea. The demon hadn't made any move to hurt him, and it hadn't really said anything hurtful to him yet. It was kind of pathetic that those were his standards for a good conversation. The demon continued to stare at him for a long, quiet moment before, with a put-upon sigh, it plopped down to sit cross-legged on the floor. It sent the wood floor a disgusted look but gave the impeccable circle an approving nod. Izuku watched it just as silently as it had watched him, though with more fear. "So, what do you want? Or should I say?" The creature paused and leaned forward to the edge of the circle. Its lips stretched into a fanged grin. "What does your heart desire?" Chapter 3: To be a hero. Summary. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Chapter text. Izuku didn't think his heart could beat any faster. It was beating a harsh rhythm against his ribcage. It worked. It worked. He hadn't expected it to work. There was a demon or some kind of eldritch being in his bedroom that he had summoned, and he didn't know what to do now. He'd gotten the damn ritual off a shady Wiccan website. It wasn't supposed to actually work. An old American saying came to mind as he stared into the golden eyes of the creature. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. He felt like that saying was pretty apt for this situation. The creature was still waiting for his answer patiently. That in itself was new. People usually snapped for him to answer them if he took too long. But the demon just sat there looking at him like it had all the time in the world. Hell, it probably did. Demons were immortal, right? It wasn't like there was any sort of time limit on these things, at least the website hadn't said so. Izuku took a deep, shuddering breath and thought about the question. He'd come into this thinking the ritual would be a bust. It was just a last-ditch effort to keep his dream alive. But it had worked. This was his chance, but he had to be careful. He didn't know much about Western beliefs, and the creature didn't look like any depiction of yokai he'd ever seen, and it had also referred to itself as a demon. All the stories of yokai depicted them as mischievous and tricky, even the good ones, and he had a feeling Western demons would be the same, if not worse. His hands clenched in his lap. What does his heart desire? Man, that was a loaded question. To be treated like an actual human being? To be able to look at himself in a mirror and not think about all the things his classmates called him? A will to live? Well, maybe not that last one. If he didn't have a will to live, he'd have given up a long time ago. He thought back to the kanji he'd carved into himself and the candles. Power, strength, confidence, hope, defiance. He thought about why he'd chosen those words, but it all just kept coming back to one thing. What did his heart desire? He picked his head up and stared deep into the demon's eyes. He forced his trembling body to still. His eyes grew steely and he set his mouth into a determined frown. He thought about all the things that had been said to him over the years. You gotta be realistic, kid. Take a swan dive off the roof. It's never going to happen. He still can't face reality. Just give up. Over the years, his will had been broken down, eroded by his peers and teachers. His mom had been the only one to ever believe in him, even if it was hesitant and fearful. He knew his mother didn't want him to go down this path. He knew his determination scared her, but he couldn't stop. It was all he'd ever wanted. He couldn't stand by and watch as others got hurt. He'd been putting himself in the line of fire since before he could remember. Every time Kaken hurt another kid, every time he saw someone needing help in any way, he couldn't stop himself. Self-sacrifice was written in his very DNA. He would never be able to stand by and watch. Last week had proven that. When Kaken had been captured by that slime villain, he'd found himself running in without a plan before he'd even noticed he was moving. This wasn't a choice for him. There had never been any other path for him. It wasn't a matter of want or need. It was a foregone conclusion. He glared at the demon with every ounce of defiance he'd stored up over the years. It didn't matter how many people told him otherwise. It didn't matter that nobody believed in him. He'd gone 10 years of being told he couldn't and he hadn't given up. He would never give up. It didn't matter how many heroes told him off. It didn't matter how many teachers sneered at him. It didn't matter how many times Kaken burned him. His heart calmed in his chest, but he could still feel it beating hard and steady like a war drum. His lungs drew in a steady breath as every bit of nervousness and fear drained from him, replaced by defiance and determination. It didn't matter if this demon made a deal with him. It didn't matter if he didn't have an ounce of power to his name. He would bend and bruise and bleed, but he would never break. He would keep on going until his heart gave out. Yue could turn him away at the gate. So what if they did? He'd just become a vigilante. It was never about the fame or money for him. He didn't care how many scars he gained or how many times his bones broke. His pain was nothing compared to the lives he could and would save. There was only one thing in his life that was certain. Only one thing that kept him going no matter how much society had tried to crush him. I will be a hero. Chapter 4. A Demon's Dealer. Summary. Demons haven't been summoned in years, so what does one think when they're ripped across the plains of existence? Chapter text. Well then, wasn't that something? The demon leaned back to observe this trembling little mouse in front of them. It had been a very long time since they'd been summoned, and this little meeting was making up for that lost time in spades. They took a deep breath in, scenting the raw, unadulterated determination that leaked from the small human child like a broken faucet. It was absolutely intoxicating, or well, it would be if it wasn't tainted by a nearly shattered sense of self-worth. With as much determination the kid had, the lack of self-esteem was off-putting. But the kid had called them of all beings, so that was to be expected. The The fates did so love saddling him with the broken ones. Not that they minded all too much. Fixing the broken, beaten, and the damned was one of their favorite things to do. Sadly, they hadn't gotten to do their favorite hobby in a long while. They weren't all too clear on why demons and other celestials had stopped being summoned. They didn't even really know how long it had been. Judging by the technology in the child's room, it had been at least a couple thousand years. But apparently, the time passed didn't matter all too much. I will be a hero. Hello, nostalgia. Thy name is Izuku Midoriya. They huffed a soft laugh. The child's face faltered, bright eyes dimming, and they could taste the heartbreak that wafted off him. They tilted their head at the abominably adorable creature before speaking. It's been quite some time since someone's requested that from me. The child's eyes sparked in confusion. Heroes must have made quite the lasting impression on the human race to have survived so long. I believe the last to make such a deal with me was... They tilted their head back in thought. What was that man's name? Leon? Leo? They jolted upright, snapping their fingers in remembrance. Leonidas. Yes, that was his name. Smart fellow. A Spartan. His wife had him very well trained. Lovely woman, truly. The boy's face had screwed up in confusion. His eyebrows lowered over his eyes and an oddly concerned tilt graced his lips. The demon chuffed. Really, it wasn't their fault the kid was ungodlily adorable. They were utterly smitten. They were fairly certain little Midoriya was the youngest summoner they'd had, and all demons had soft spots for kids. I don't really have much to give you, but I have Katsudan. Was it possible for a demon to adopt a human? And well, if that's not enough, the child took a deep breath, you can have my soul. Well, now back it up. What? They froze in place, eyes latching onto the squirming boy. What the absolute fuck was society teaching kids these days? The kid went from offering them what they assumed was human food to cutting straight to bargaining his soul. Yup, this kid was theirs. Something else was going to crawl out of the woodwork and devour this kid if they didn't take him. It was best to disabuse the kid of whatever ideas were floating around in that peanut brain of his. Your soul has no value to me. They rolled their head in contemplation. They'd already decided to honor the deal, but what did they want? What could this tiny, weak, mewling child offer them? The boy wanted to be a hero? Okay. A fanged smile grew across their face. Their wings twitched and their tail whipped behind them. Their neck cracked as they stood and leaned forward, just to the edge of the circle. Magic, raw and untamed, flowed through the air the closer they got to the boundary line. Truly extraordinary work for a novice. You want to be a hero, boy? All right then, I'll make you a deal. I'll grant you power, and in exchange, you'll act as my host on the earthly plane. The kid wanted to be the next Perseus? They could do that, but they wanted to see the chaos unfold. They wanted to see the world tremble at the might of this tiny, adorably breakable child. They wanted a front-row seat to the absolute anarchy this kid was going to cause. The boy's soul pulsed with resentment and defiance, and a thirst for justice through any means necessary threaded its way through the kid's very being. The fates knew they favored the forgotten or cast-offs of society. It was ever so satisfying to watch the sheep-like humans cower from the very people their pathetic society had sought to destroy. They'd never stuck around to actually participate with the growth of their dealers, preferring to watch from afar until the deal was done. But they'd never had a summoner so very young and not broken, but nearly there. For this deal, they wanted to see the inevitable chaos this child would herald. So, with a sharp-toothed smile, they extended their hand and waited. Tension built in the room, raising like heat in a furnace. The boy stalled, but quickly steeled himself and reached forward. His tiny fingers hesitated at the edge of the barrier. Teary but hopeful green eyes met theirs. Will it hurt? The child's voice was so very innocent. It made the demon's empty chest ache. Everyone always assumed demons were cruel and emotionless, and to a degree they were right, but something people always forgot was that demons saw the worst of humanity. They saw true depravity and evil. Those rare instances they got the absolute pleasure of witnessing innocence were treasured. A demon would never harm an innocent. It was why a sigil for hope had called a demon Demons were the hidden protectors of the innocent. They were the gatekeepers, the punishers. So when the demon next spoke, its words were soft and sincere. No, you won't feel a thing, just like going to sleep. The child hesitated for just a second longer before reaching through the barrier. The demon gently grasped Izuku's small hand. Their massive hand enveloped the other and the shadows surged. All light in the room was drowned by their darkness. The barrier fizzled out and unleashed the flood of shadows. Their non-corporal form washed over the boy's body, settling over his skin and vanishing beneath it. The boy squeaked in fright. His eyes squeezed shut before he reluctantly opened them. He rose his hand in front of his face, fascinated by the shadowy tendrils disappearing into his skin. A hurricane of shadows whipped around him, and then the room went black. Chapter 5: Changes. Summary. Izuku gets his first taste of dysphoria. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Izuku woke up on his bed in his perfectly normal bedroom. There was no pentagram painted on the floor. There were no bowls of blood or candles. He stared up at his ceiling in a daze. Last night had to have been a dream. There was no other explanation. But if last night had been a dream, then why the ever-loving fuck were his hands black? His eyes stared in stunned disbelief at the inky black skin that had replaced his normally pale hand. He shot out of his bed, stumbling to the mirror mounted on his door. There was a weight on his back, one that was throwing his balance off, but he refused to look. If he looked, then that meant last night was real, and if last night was real, then... He froze in front of the mirror, hands gripping the door frame. Last night was real. He made a deal with a demon. At least his face looked the same. Kinda? His pupils were gold. Why were his pupils gold? A small hysterical chuckle leaked from him before black dots started appearing across his vision. A high-pitched ringing began in his ears. Breath. His lungs expanded, drawing in precious oxygen. He flinched away from the door and buried his hands in his hair. There was a voice in his head. Why was there a voice in his head? Breath, child. He whimpered instead. Oh God, he was going crazy. He made a deal with a demon, and now he was hearing voices, and his hands were black, and there were fucking wings on his back. What have I gotten myself into? Izuku squeaked again. All right, recap. He did the ritual and a demon appeared. He made a deal with a demon. Everything got fuzzy after carving in that last character, but he knew he made a deal with the demon. Okay. So the voice in his head was the demon. All right, he could deal with that. He looked back at the mirror and really took a look at himself. He was as skinny as ever, but his hands were black. He brought his hands up to his face. The skin was a deep abyssal black, so dark they looked flat. It looked like someone had taken two hand-shaped chunks out of reality. He let out a long breath and lifted his pant legs up. Yup, his feet were the same. They were the same deep black, but they looked bigger than they should. Not by much, but it was definitely noticeable. His nails had become talons on both his hands and feet. What did you do to me? He asked as he stretched the leather-like membranes of the almost bat-like wings on his back. They were that same black as his hands and feet, but despite being thin, they were tough. He couldn't stretch the wing out all the way. The room was too small. He looked back at his reflection. A twinge went through his head and heart before abruptly disappearing. I gave you what you wanted. Something caressed his legs and he jerked in place, head snapping down. Tendrils rose from his shadow, twining up his calves. He took another steadying breath and clenched his hands. A small laugh bubbled from him. The talons on his hands clicked as they scraped his palms. I can be a hero, he whispered, gazing at his changed skin, and, holy shit, is that a tail? The demon in his head laughed. There was a thin tail lazily floating behind him. He could feel it vaguely if he concentrated. It'll be a while before you can feel your wings and tail. Your mind is struggling to comprehend the changes. I'm dealing with it, but you may experience some discomfort occasionally. Okay. He gave another soft laugh. His tail curled around his leg. How was he going to explain this to his mom? How was he going to explain this to anyone? So what all did you do or give me? The demon took a minute, shifting in his mind. It was so weird that he could feel it moving. He stood there waiting, continuously looking over his new changes. He avoided looking at his reflection again. He didn't like the twinges that went through his head whenever he caught sight of it. He figured that was the discomfort the demon was talking about. I was unable to give you very much. Your body was unable to take what I wanted to give you, so I had to make some adjustments. I gave you the most beneficial changes first. The only actual power I was able to give you were the shadows. You'll have to wait until your body can handle the rest. Izuku looked down at the tendrils still curled around his legs, and now that he was actually looking for something, he became startlingly aware of where the shadows were in his room. They will obey you. Just ensure you praise them. They live to please. He gave another small laugh and reached down to touch the squirming shadows. He could feel them in his mind, whispering to him in a language he couldn't understand. Soft voices rose up around him, all coming from different shadows. Izuku, you're going to be late. The door jiggled before opening, and all he could do was watch in stupefied horror as his mother walked into his bedroom. She froze as she caught sight of him. His tail twitched in an instinctual display of discomfort. I think I got my quirk? Notes. Bit of a short chapter, but the next one will be a good bit longer to make up for it. Chapter 6. Doctors and Instincts. Summary. Izuku goes to the doctor. Chapter text. And you say you woke up like this? The doctor asked as she walked around him. Izuku shifted uncomfortably. It was a bit awkward to have someone looking at him like he was a science experiment. Was this how people felt when he nerded out over their quirks? If so, he had a lot of people to apologize to. Yes, ma'am. He was tired both physically and mentally. He'd only gotten roughly 3 hours of sleep, and his time awake had been filled with frantic questions from his mother, followed by the seemingly unending curiosity of the demon. The entire ride to the hospital had been filled with nothing but questions and comments, and the demon just wouldn't shut up. They went on and on and on about the car they drove in, the buildings, the people. Izuku had to admit, though, the demon's reaction to the different kinds of clothing was highly entertaining. Now, he was in a hospital room after going through x-rays of his feet, hands, and tail. His wings didn't fit in the machine, so they had to get a doctor with an x-ray vision quirk, the same doctor in front of him. His condition was an utter mystery for the medical staff, and given they were medical professionals, that meant tests. Different doctors had been in and out of the room, reading over his chart and records with mystified expressions. I've managed to get a hold of your initial quirk test, she said as she clipped a copy of his original x-ray up on the wall. Your last doctor performed the vestigial test, and usually this is enough. However, if you look here, she pointed to the image of his 4-year-old foot, you had the extra toe joint linked to quirk development. This would usually be enough to pronounce you quirkless, but you obviously aren't. So we took another picture. She pointed to the next image. The foot in the picture was significantly larger and different. There were far more bones than he thought there should be. As you can see, there's been quite the change. You've spontaneously grown 2 extra joints in all of your toes and another joint where your metatarsals should be. There, so you'll be able to grab things mid-flight. He adamantly ignored the demon. He hadn't told either the doctor or his mom about the whole hearing voices thing, and he didn't really know if he wanted to. It's uncommon for kids to develop a quirk despite having the toe joint. It happens, but never like this. Mutant quirks always show themselves in the x-rays, even before they fully manifest. I'd have to say you're the first of your kind, the oldest quirk manifestation on file, and the strangest. The doctor placed her hands in the pockets of her lab coat. Her eyes roamed over his wings curiously. How do your new additions feel? Sometimes there can be issues with manifested mutant quirks that need to be addressed. His mother perked up, eyes turning sharp. Her gaze flitted to him. He shifted again and gave her a smile. She was always so hyper-attentive when it came to him. When he was younger, he'd thought it was because of his quirklessness, but after he'd snapped on her when he was 10, they'd had a long conversation on why she was the way she was. He was the only thing she had, and she was the only thing he had. They were equally protective of each other. His mom didn't have very many friends or family, and she latched onto those she had with an iron grip. Izuku was the same way. I can't really feel them, like at all. His tail flicked and his wings shifted. It's not like they're numb. I just can't feel them. It's like they're not there. The doctor nodded, turning to type on her computer. His mother worried her lip but stayed silent. All right, as you're aware, my quirk is X-ray. Using my quirk, I'd like to check the bones and joints in your wings. I have a specialist degree in avian and winged flight quirks. Do I have permission to use my quirk on you? Izuku's eyes widened and leaned forward, deeply wishing he had one of his notebooks. How did it work? Did she project rays of light only she could see? Was it like echolocation that only worked on bones? Or maybe she emitted X radiation through her eyes? Izuku. His head snapped to his mother. A soft, exasperated smile sat on her face. She rose an eyebrow and tilted her head at the doctor. The doctor was waiting for him to respond. He jolted in his seat, smiling sheepishly. Sorry, you can use your quirk on me. The doctor smiled, amusement shining in her eyes. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Nothing happened for a moment before her indigo hair began glowing white. Her eyes opened to show the same white. Can you stretch your wings out as much as you can? He did so as much as he could, but his wing shuddered, dropping halfway to the ground. He gritted his teeth and tried to raise the wing only for it to flop around. He could vaguely tell how to open them, likely an instinct the demon gave him, but actually doing it was like trying to move a limb that was asleep. Can I touch you? He nodded his head before answering a tad awkwardly. Oh yeah, sure. The doctor didn't waste time grabbing his outstretched wing. She lifted it gently, deceptively strong. Her lips twisted into a frown before her eyes dimmed. There's nothing wrong in the wing itself. I'd like to check the other one as well if that's all right. She waited again for his response before activating her quirk again. She repeated the same procedure on his other wing. Okay, Mr. Midoriya, would you mind turning around for me? He did so with only a bit of hesitance. An instinct in the back of his head shrieked in protest and the demon growled. He didn't even realize he'd done the same until he noticed how silent the room was. His body was only halfway turned and wouldn't turn any further. He looked at the doctor. She'd stepped back slightly, though her expression hadn't changed. In fact, she almost seemed like she'd expected the reaction. His mother, on the other hand, looked absolutely appalled. The doctor powered down her quirk and stepped back again with a smile. Izuku's face heated, eyes widening in embarrassment. His eyes widened and darted around the room as anxiety joined his embarrassment. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. The doctor only laughed. It's perfectly fine, Mr. Midoriya. Most mutant quirks come with their own set of instincts, predatory mutations even more so. I'm going to refer you to a mutation quirk specialist for counseling. They can handle figuring out what other instincts you have and how to handle them. Izuku sat up a bit straighter at the mention of a quirk specialist. Excitement roared through him. He'd only ever been to one quirk specialist, back when he was getting tested at 4. He couldn't remember that appointment, so this would be his first time actually meeting with a specialist that he could remember. Now, due to the physiological changes caused by your quirk, we're going to have to do some tests to determine what allergies or nutritional requirements you have. His mom smiled blankly before standing. I'm going to call in the rest of the day at work. Chapter 7, Child of War. Summary. The demon gets a name and Izuku figures out why Bakugo is such a dick. Notes. My internet was being slow, so tell me if there's any errors. Thanks for reading. Chapter text. I do not understand why we must do this. Izuku rolled his eyes at his companion and continued pulling on his uniform. It had been a week since he'd made the deal. A long week of questions and tests and anxiety. There was a massive adjustment period, both for the Midoriyas and the demon. The demon didn't understand anything about the society Izuku lived in, and Izuku didn't understand the demon's rather brutal views or the changes to his body. School's important. The demon huffed in annoyance. 8 hours a day wasted doing nothing when we could be training or working. Does nobody have anything urgent to do in this society? This was his first day back to school after taking the last week to get used to his new powers, and he was spending the morning struggling with his new uniform and arguing with his partner. Izuku sighed, turning to and fro in front of the mirror. His uniform had been tailored for his wings and tail, but anxiety had him second-guessing himself. Maybe it was too early to go back to school. What would Kaken say? What would anyone say? You would look better in a robe. Robes aren't worn anymore, he said as he adjusted the flaps in his gakurin around his wing membranes. All right, he could do this. How hard could it be? All he had to do was go to school. Same thing he'd been doing for 10 years. He didn't even have to talk to the teachers. They already knew. His mom had called the school the day after he went to his quirk specialist. All he had to deal with were his classmates. Oh God, he was going to die. Kaken was going to kill him. He was going to get laughed at and everyone would stare at him. What if they found out? His hands buried themselves in his hair and a high-pitched whine left him. His wings wrapped themselves around him like a hug. The shadows murmured vaguely comforting things in their eldritch language. You'll be fine, and if you aren't, then I'll be there. I gave you power. Nothing will harm you. Easy enough for the demon to say. But they didn't know Kaken. Despite his doubt, his heart calmed. Yeah, he had a demon on his side. He'd be fine. He took a deep, slow breath. He'd be fine. He looked at the mirror, staring into his golden pupils. He could feel the demons staring back at him. They were right. He had power now and he wasn't alone. Izuku took another breath, straightened his back, and marched out of the apartment after grabbing his bag. He walked, head held high, almost halfway to school before his anxiety came back. So, this might be a bit late, but what's your name? He was so glad nobody was out so early. It would be so embarrassing if someone heard him talking to himself. I have no name, not one you could pronounce anyway. His tail curled behind him as a small smile crawled up his face. His hands clenched around his book bag straps. Okay, would you mind if I gave you one? He could feel the demon rolling the thought around before agreeing. Very well. There was a bit of some emotion in the demon's voice that made Izuku think this was more important than he thought. All right, so let's see. We could use a regular name or maybe we could make one. Like, you're a demon, so maybe something with ma in it. 'Cause ma means demon. What about Maku? It's like Izuku and demon combined. He continued coming up with names as he walked, his tail wagging behind him in his excitement. The demon made the occasional comment on the names but didn't agree to any. Izuku suddenly perked up. What about Gorin? Go means guardian and Rin means companion. The demon went still in his head, contemplating the name. Izuku smiled wider. This was the best reaction he'd gotten from the demon. I like it. Guardian companion. Gorin. Yes, I like that very much. Izuku practically skipped the rest of the way to Aldera. He froze just down the street from the gates, anxiety making his heart clench and his stomach roll. He wasn't alone. He'd be fine. He continued walking, slower and with fear slowly building in him. The closer to the school he got, the more students he could see. His shoulders hunched over before his spine was suddenly forced straight. His wings went slightly lax and his tail waved just above the concrete. Hold your head up high, boy. You are better than these peons and you will not show them fear. Whispers rose up as he began to pass other students, and no matter how much he wanted to curl into a ball and disappear, Gorin wouldn't let him. His back stayed straight, every muscle in his body relaxed as if he wasn't internally panicking. Holy shit, is that Deku? He tried to walk faster, but his body disobeyed him. Gorin snarled in his mind, and it took him a moment to figure out why. What happened to Deku? Just wait for Bakugu to see this. Deku really wants to die, doesn't he? Coming here looking like that. Goran's snarling grew louder in his mind. Deku. They were snarling at the name, and now that he was paying attention, every time he heard that name he felt something. It was like invisible shackles around his wrists and ankles, like he was physically being dragged down by the name. He'd never felt that before. Names have power. To give someone a name is to mark them. It is a claim on them and sometimes a taint. Names can give a being power, but they can also take that power away. It depends on the intent behind the name. Izuku stopped in front of his classroom door, a feeling of anger rising in him. He quickly buried the emotion like he'd done a million times before, but unlike every other time he'd done it, this time the anger came back worse. It bubbled through his veins like magma. His lips twisted into a snarl before he caught himself. He was usually good at controlling his anger, but he'd been losing control since he'd summoned Goran. He opened the door and stepped inside. Instantly, the room went silent. Naba-sensei looked up and stared at him with wide eyes. The teachers had only been told Izuku had manifested a quirk, not any specifics on what that quirk was. His anxiety tried to make a reappearance only to be ruthlessly crushed by his companion. A small tendril of satisfaction weaved through him. Izuku nodded at the teacher, completely unaware of the look of contempt on his face. The anger was still coursing through him. Deku? Piercing green and gold eyes met crimson red and Goran cackled, a dark sense of amusement radiating from the demon. It's been a while since I've seen a child of Ares. Chapter 8. Demonic Culture Shock. Summary. Izuku nearly kills Bakugo and proceeds to get a short lecture on demonic culture and customs. Notes. TW. Molestation is mentioned but not in human terms. Not graphic or anything, but better safe than sorry. This chapter is a bit longer than I thought it'd be. But whatever. Thanks for reading, and I love reading the comments. They give me life. Chapter text. Izuku was trying valiantly not to hyperventilate. What was his life becoming? Kaken? A child of Ares? What was a child of Ares? His mind ran through theory after theory trying to understand. Had Aunt Mitsuki cheated on Uncle Masaru? Did Kaken know? He desperately wished he could talk to Goran telepathically. The demon couldn't just throw something like that out there and not expect him to start questioning every facet of his life. Naba-sensei droned on in the background, but it was hard to pay attention when he was occupied going through everything he'd read in the past week, trying to figure out just what Goran had meant. Ares sounded like a name, so maybe it was another demon? If it was, then everything made so much more sense. Kaken had been called a demon child pretty consistently throughout their childhood. His tail swished agitatedly behind him. Luckily, Naba-sensei had moved his seat to the back of the class so his wings and tail wouldn't bother anyone. The class was suspiciously quiet. Many of the other students were blatantly staring at him, while others were trying their best to ignore his existence. Kaken was one of the ones staring, and, try as he might, Izuku couldn't stop focusing on him. Every time he looked at him, he kept trying to find Uncle Masaru in his features. Kaken really didn't look anything like his step-dad. The only thing they shared was spiky hair, but Kaken's mom had spiky hair too. He didn't realize the lunch bell had rung, a fatal mistake, until a burning hand slammed down on his desk. He jolted, shoulders hunching, and hesitantly looked up. Crimson eyes burning with fury glared down at him. Kaken snarled down at him like usual, but this time real fury tainted his gaze. Kaken was always angry, even as a child, but there was a difference between his usual anger and this boiling fury. He was talking, yelling really, but Izuku tuned him out. He stared blankly at his once friend. Part of him wanted to listen, but the rest was still hyper-focused on the bomb Goran dropped on him. Or, well, he was focused until he was yanked out of his seat. He yelped in surprise, wings flaring out to catch his balance. Kaken's entourage scrambled back out of the way of the flailing membranes. "Are you listening now, you piece of shit? I asked you a goddamn question. Deku." Listen when I'm fucking talking to you. His heart stuttered in his chest. He took a deep, slow breath, trying to follow his counselor's advice. His body ached to retaliate, but he couldn't let himself. He wouldn't let himself. Goran snarled and whispered seductive taunts. The demon wanted to fight, wanted to beat Kakin into the ground. His arms tingled as he forced himself not to move. Izuku glared up into Kakin's burning red eyes and saw them light up. Crimson red turned scarlet, and the other boy's hands began to burn. Izuku wouldn't fight him, but he most certainly wouldn't submit. A week ago, he wouldn't even think about challenging Kakin in any way, but with a demon calling for violence in his head and unholy instincts raging through him, he couldn't just stand there placidly like he usually would. The room went quiet. Kakin's buddies glanced between the two as the tension rose. Every second that passed felt like an extra 100 pounds were being added to his shoulders, but he didn't back down. Then, finally, Kakin's eyes glanced away and Izuku moved. An instinctual satisfaction ran through him as he slapped Kakin's hand off his shoulder. He turned away and grabbed his things with a small smile, beginning to leave the classroom. Maybe he'd actually eat in the lunchroom today. Kakin shouldn't bother him, he'd won after all. Maybe it was a bit childish to feel so accomplished winning a staring contest, but he'd never won anything against Kakin. His tail bounced cheerily behind him. He frowned suddenly, a soft burst of hot air brushing past his tail. A split second later, a burning hand grasped his tail and his instincts went wild. If Kakin's anger had been a boiling fury, then Izuku's was an outright miasma of rage. His body twisted, claws extended. Every ounce of human rationality was shunted to the very back of his mind, replaced by demonic fury. His wings lashed out, slamming the other boys into the wall. The grip of his tail vanished, but it was all too late. Izuku lunged, tackling Kakin to the floor. The hooked talon on the joint of his wing dug into the floor beside Katsuki's head. His hand wrapped around the other boy's neck in a punishing grip, claws so very close to puncturing the delicate skin, but his fingers wouldn't move any further. His body was frozen, every limb locked up. Slowly, very, very slowly, Izuku came back to himself. Anger still thrummed through him, but it was joined by something else, something he had never felt before. He felt violated. He ripped himself away, stumbling as his wings were yanked out of the floor. He stood there for a moment in the stunted silence, just staring at Kakin, not sure what to do or say or feel. Why did he react like that? Why did he feel this way? He didn't know the answer to either of those questions, and he didn't really want to know. He took a step back, watching as Kakin lifted a hand to his neck and his fingers came away red. Izuku's heart stopped and his ears began to ring. A sharp squealing sound like the few times he'd gotten a concussion. He hurt Kakin. He made him bleed, and suddenly he couldn't breathe. He was drawing air in gasping breaths, but his lungs didn't seem to be working. He took another step back. Black edged in around the sides of his vision, everything suddenly becoming so much darker, except for the blood. The blood shined ruby red. He could smell it. The rich coppery scent he was so familiar with was replaced with an almost candy-sweet smell. What was wrong with him? Unable to stand the sight, the smell, he bolted. His mind went blank. He just needed to get away. Away from the blood and the smell and Kakin. He dodged around students and ignored the yell of teachers. One moment he was in the classroom, the next he was outside. He leaned against the roof access door and slid to the ground. He wheezed as he tried and failed to breathe. He was okay. He was away, and the only thing he could smell was the lingering rain from last night and the trash that had been left on the roof. There wasn't any blood. There weren't any stares or angry shouts. There wasn't anybody else but him. Are you done now? Izuku flinched hard, slamming his head against the metal door. He'd completely forgotten about Goran. Guilt stabbed him, but betrayal chased it away. Why didn't you help me? He could barely feel the demon in his mind. He felt oddly lonely without the presence pressing against his thoughts. If I had, I likely would have encouraged you to kill the whelp. I went through the effort of stopping you only because it would have been a truly pathetic first kill. He sucked in a sharp breath at the reminder. He nearly killed Kaken. He tried to kill Kaken. This was bad. He tried killing someone. That wasn't what a hero did. That was what villains did. This was what he got for making a deal with a demon. What was he expecting? Sunshine and fucking rainbows. Child, I can literally feel you overthinking. You were justified. More than justified, really. Though I suggest you prepare to deal with more advances. Putting down a child of Ares will only make them pursue you more. They don't do well with inferiority, or rejection for that matter. What are you even talking about? How could I have been justified in trying to kill him? It doesn't work like that. Killing isn't right. You can't just pick and choose if it's okay to do it or not. Goran snorted derisively. Oh, and were you just to allow him to molest you? Izuku's thoughts screeched to a halt, leaving him staring blankly ahead. And molest? What are you talking about? He didn't molest me. His brows furrowed as he thought over the confrontation. A shudder worked its way up his spine and he gripped his tail protectively. His wings wrapped around him, shielding him from some unseen, imaginary danger. Exactly that. Child. Izuku really didn't like Goran's new softer tone. The tail is one of the most vital and sensitive limbs a demon has. A demon with a damaged tail is a dead one. They are instrumental in flight, basic balance, and combat. To touch one's tail without consent is to violate them. It is like putting a blade against another's throat. It is only done either in battle or in bed. Izuku's face went bright red at the insinuation before paling. He looked at the long whip-like appendage in his hands. His tail was almost 8 feet long and was tipped with a razor-sharp spade-shaped fan. It would have almost looked like a stereotypical devil's tail if the fan weren't nearly as large as his head. What do we do then? That is for you to decide. I know nothing about this era and nothing about this culture. However, I suggest propositioning your mother to unenroll you from this paltry establishment. I cannot guarantee I won't kill that boy if we remain here. Chapter 9, Figures and Friends. Summary. Inko is best mom and Izuku fears for Bakugu's life. Notes. Extra long chapter 'cause I missed last week. Chapter text. Izuku was of the firm opinion that his mother was one of the most terrifying beings in existence. Even Goran was silent and still in his mind, like somehow his mother would know if the demon made so much as a comment. The green-haired woman herself muttered obscenities and threats of bodily harm under her breath as she wrote furiously in her work journal. The journal was what made Izuku grieve for his soon-to-be legally demolished school and Kaken. Izuku knew very well that Midoriya Inko was not a woman to be trifled with. There was a reason Izuku was as good of a child as he was, and his lack of friends and general fear of people were only partially to blame. He'd left the school halfway through lunch and went home to wait for his mom to get off work. Of course, he'd texted his mom that something had happened at school and that he was fine but didn't feel safe returning. It wasn't his safety he feared for, but his mother didn't need to know that. He tried assuring her that, no, she didn't need to come home, and it could absolutely wait until her shift was over. Inko was home not even 20 minutes after that conversion. Izuku snorted, like something so trivial as work would ever be able to get in his mother's way. Really, he should have known better. The conversation had gone as well as it could. That is to say, absolutely heart-wrenchingly terrible. There were tears on both sides and comforting to be had. He'd come completely clean about his treatment at the school and the things Kaken had done and said, and by the end, his mother was seething. It was only when she pulled out her journal that Izuku remembered his mom's status as a mandated reporter. Please don't put Kaken in jail. It was a desperate plea, he knew, but he still had to try. Kaken would probably be safer in jail than anywhere near Inko. He was genuinely afraid for Katsuki's life at this point. He knew damned well what his mother was capable of and had no desire to see her formidable might come down on Kaken's head. Inko finally looked up from her notes, wide green eyes almost serene. She smiled in that way that never failed to make him feel like he was staring down the barrel of a gun as she pulled out her phone. "Zuzu, baby, mommy's gonna have some friends come over. I'll transfer some money into your account, so why don't you go have fun, okay?" The smile made it very clear it wasn't a suggestion. Years of conditioning and the lingering scraps of his self-preservation instincts had him up and halfway to his room before she'd even finished. He closed the door quietly and immediately slumped against the door. "Your mother is terrifying." Izuku laughed helplessly. "Tell me something I don't know." He moved robotically around the room, grabbing his keys, wallet, and notebook. He picked up his earbuds and phone charger just in case. He had a feeling he knew what friends his mom was calling and figured it'd probably be a while for them to handle their business. Mom works at the Mizutafu Hero Hospital. Apparently, a lot of the patients never listen to the nurses, so Mom has to get firm with them. Not to mention all the villain attacks on the hospital. Mom can get really scary when she wants to because of all that. "And these friends your mother is inviting?" "Lawyers. A lot of people will try suing doctors, even heroes. Mom's had a couple try and fail." Izuku went quiet as he left his room, peeking into the kitchen where his mom was pacing. "I'm leaving now." She looked up momentarily to give him a warm smile that instinctively had him smiling back. "Be careful and have fun, Izuku." With a fixed smile and a nod, Izuku set about getting as far away from the impending disaster that was his mother. He closed the door as quickly as possible and immediately bolted down the street. He slowed to a walk and shoved his earbuds in when he was a block away from his apartment. With pegboard nerds blasting in his ears, he boarded the next train to the closest mall. Gorin didn't like the subway. Something about being underground put the demon on edge. Izuku hadn't bothered to ask, but he sympathized with his partner. It was cramped despite being the middle of the day, and it felt like everyone was staring at him. His wings rustled uneasily. A woman a couple feet away pulled her daughter to her other side and eyed him with distrust. He ignored it. He knew all about the many forms Quirk discrimination took. He'd been subjected to it for as long as he could remember. Granted, this was an entirely new kind of discrimination. He couldn't say it didn't hurt a bit, but it wasn't like there was anything he could do about it. Not right now, at least. He'd change it when he became a hero, and wasn't that a trip to think about? He was going to be a hero. A slightly manic grin crept up his face and he bobbed his head to his music. He didn't have to worry about what-ifs anymore, and that did wonders for his anxiety. Sure, those worries had been replaced by the possibility of someone figuring out what he'd done to get his powers. Even if someone did figure it out, nobody would ever believe them. His manic grin slowly cooled into a devilish smirk. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see the woman grab her kid in an iron grip before muscling her way to the other side of the train car. He shrugged, wings shifting as he did. Really, it wasn't too much different from when someone figured out he was quirkless. His giddiness lasted until he got to the mall. People cleared out of his way. He tried to ignore the odd sense of satisfaction that gave him, as he made his way towards his favorite hero merch store. He curled his tail around his leg as he browsed the shelves, not wanting to knock anything over. Hero figures lined the walls, the more expensive ones encased in glass showcases. Large life-sized figures of the top 10 stood at the front of the store. A girl was at the end of the aisle, staring balefully at the figures higher up on the shelves. Izuku glanced at her before looking back at the Maruko figure he was thinking about buying. The passive whispering of shadows in his mind suddenly picked up in volume. He straightened with a frown and tried to figure out what they were trying to say to him. He still couldn't understand them, but he'd figured out how to guess what they wanted. They usually only brought his attention to things they thought he'd be interested in, so he'd quickly picked up the habit of following their nudges. The only person in the aisle with him was the girl. This time, though, she was on her toes trying and failing to reach for a figure. Her fingers just barely brushed the edge of the box before she stumbled back. Izuku stared, chest feeling tight with anxiety as he got what the shadows were pointing him towards. He really hoped she wouldn't talk to him if he went over there. He wasn't sure his heart could take it if she did. Regardless of his anxiety, he began walking over. He plucked his earbuds out. Do you want some help? Oh God, what if she thought he was an employee and got all rude like those people on Reddit? He really didn't think he could handle it if that happened. The girl looked at him with impassive eyes. Her eyes trailed along his wings down to his fiddling hands. His face burned. He knew this was a bad idea. Stupid shadows making him socialize. Oh, sorry, the girl's face went a bit red and her eyes widened a bit after a solid minute of silent staring. Sorry dash, yeah. Could you get the Starbeat Herocon down for me? Look, someone almost as socially awkward as you. He resisted the urge to scowl or snap back at the demon and instead turned his gaze to the wall of figures. He almost unconsciously began listing what he knew of Starbeat. Number 32 in the rankings. Quirk, Songburst. Has the ability to amplify the abilities both physical and quirk-wise of those within a certain range when listening to music. Range is approximately a 152 centimeters, 5 foot, radius, depending on the song used, able to increase her own base stats but not to the degree of her partner's. He grabbed the figure in question, quirking a smile at the star-themed hero before turning around. He froze. The girl stood there looking utter gobsmacked. Her impassive eyes had gone wide and a hint of excitement sparked in them. She smiled as she took the figure from him. Are you a fan? She glanced up at him, dark purple eyes lighting up. Izuku smiled back at her a bit more shakily but replied nonetheless. I like all heroes. Well, most heroes. He added the last part with a faint grimace. He still liked All Might but not nearly as much as he had. What had been borderline idealistic worship had cooled down to a much more reasonable hero fanaticism. Then there was Endeavor? The two hero fans shared a commiserating look. A lot of hero fans were eagerly awaiting the day Endeavor lost his license. His property damage rates were the highest in the rankings, not to mention his criminal mortality rate. The commission needed to either shorten his leash or pull him from duty entirely. Izuku's eyes lit up and he sketched a short bow. Midoriya Izuku, it's a pleasure to meet you. The girl smirked and bowed back. Kyokujiro, nice to meet you too. The two teens walked around the store trash talking their least favorite heroes and gushing about their favorites. Izuku's earbuds remained forgotten around his neck. The shadows bubbled with satisfaction. In the end, Izuku picked out a new All Might Bronze Age figure, a number 13 figure and a Hawks figure. He absolutely didn't regret spending nearly 30,000 yen, about $200, on figures. No matter how much his heart shriveled in his chest at the price. How much money do you have? Kyoka asked incredulously at the register. Izuku shrugged. Mom wants me out of the house for a couple hours. Probably the rest of the day with how much she gave me. Kyoka looked an odd combination of curious and hesitant. Why did your mom give you that much money to keep you out? Izuku smiled brightly. She's talking to vampires and didn't want me interfering. Kyoka looked even more curious and hesitant if that was possible. The cashier gave him a dead-eyed stare as he swiped his card. Vampires? I mean lawyers. Chapter 10. Falling. Summary. Izuku confronts his past and learns how to fly. Notes. TW suicide baiting. I was listening to Disturbed while writing this. Grunge is unsurprisingly good for writing angst. Chapter text. You're insane, Izuku screamed, clutching the lightning rod with every ounce of strength he had. Don't be a pussy, Izuku. We're not even that high up. Izuku whimpered as a gust of wind nearly ripped him from the pole. Thousands of feet stood between Izuku and the cold, hard ground. The Tokyo cityscape was lit up in the glow of traffic lights. The rain falling leisurely around him refracted the lights like millions of multicolored diamonds. If he weren't so terrified, the view would be beautiful. As it was, Izuku clung tightly to the only thing stopping him from plummeting to the ground. His teeth clacked together, small whimpers leaving him in between screamed protests. The rain plastered his pajamas to his skin and his hair stuck to his face and neck. "Fuck you, Gorin. Take me home. Now." He could feel the demon roll their eyes at his completely reasonable demands. He was far past caring about his partner's opinion, though. He wanted to go home to his mom and his nice, warm, safe bed. "You have wings, dumbass. Use them." "Wings I don't know how to fucking use." Izuku let out a yelp as his foot slipped from the metal rung he was standing on. His tail whipped out to wrap around the structure. He could feel the push and pull of the wind against the sensitive appendage, and it only made him cling harder. His wings were pressed tight against his back. He didn't know how he'd gotten here or really where here was. Between one blink and the next, he'd appeared on the roof of a building. Gorin expected him to just let go and fall, and in Izuku's humble opinion Gorin could go fuck themself. There was no way in hell he was letting go. A hero could bring their ass up there and pry him away from the lightning rod. A sigh reverberated through his mind. "Relax, Izuku. You are in no real danger. You need to learn to fly, and the best way to do so is to fall. If you do not catch yourself, the shadows will do it for you. Regardless, you are not going home until you manage to at least glide." Izuku took deep, shuddering breaths before slowly opening his eyes, only to slam them shut again. His head spun and his stomach dropped. He ground his teeth together and fought off his nausea. Gorin was right. He needed to learn to fly. The entrance exam was in 6 months. He'd spent the last 4 dealing with online schooling and physical therapy. His counselor had cleared him for flying just last week. "There are other ways to learn, Gorin. Safer ways." The demon scoffed in response. There was no reasoning with them, Izuku knew. Gorin was the most stubborn being Izuku had ever had the displeasure of knowing. He hissed in a breath as an icy wind blew through him. Okay, he just had to let go and then he could go home, right? He could do this. He could. He just had to. Take a swan dive off the roof. Izuku whimpered again. Tears pricked at the edge of his eyes. He didn't want to. He didn't want to fall. He didn't want to give up. His heart clenched in his chest. "Let go, Izuku." Why? After so long, 10 long years, why did he end up here? He'd spent years blocking out the taunts and teases. He'd pushed back every hateful thought. He'd tried so hard not to give in, and yet he still ended up on a rooftop. He gripped the pole tighter. He'd been singled out, pushed to the brink, and still hung on. He'd gripped onto his dream with bloody, beaten hands and refused to give up. It was almost funny. The absolute irony. You need to fall before you can fly. There was something deeper to Gorin's voice. It was almost like they knew what Izuku had gone through, how close he'd been to breaking. Izuku was a boy made up of jagged shards of glass desperately holding together. With a deep growl, Izuku pried his eyes open. His eyes locked onto his arms. Bright red hazard lights splashed against his pale skin and dyed the rainwater red like blood. His scars stood out against the gloom of night. Power. Strength. Confidence. Hope. Defiance. He'd almost forgotten, hadn't he, why he'd done all this in the first place. Defiance lit up bright gold against his skin. Izuku huffed a soft laugh that sounded more like a sob. It had only taken 4 months for him to forget. Defiance ran in his blood, but he'd kind of forgotten over the past couple months, hadn't he? His determination had flagged. It was like after so long of fighting for his dream, the moment he got a reprieve he'd collapsed. There were still shackles holding him down, and he needed to break them. He refused to have anything holding him down. Izuku closed his eyes again and leaned his forehead against the freezing metal. He refused to have anything holding him back. He refused to be shackled to his past. No matter how much it hurt to think about, how his heart felt like it would fall apart if he looked too closely. He couldn't afford to ignore the chains around him. With his heart in his throat, he began to think about his life leading up to this point. It's not gonna happen. Just give up. He felt like he was choking. "I'm sorry, Izuku." His head pounded with the rain and lightning flashed overhead. You know, you can kinda read Izuku's name like Deku. Red eyes flashed through his mind, full of malice and greed. A useless person? Fucking worthless. Had that always hurt so much? He didn't remember. When had he forgotten what it felt like to be a person? He wouldn't be that person anymore. He refused to cower away and let people use him. He could feel the chains circling around him, binding his heart and soul. His arms relaxed around the pole. He took a deep breath, maybe his last, before letting go. The wind rushed up against him, colder and yet warmer than before. He fell alongside the rain. His tail streamed above him. For one moment it was like gravity let go of him. The world seemed to fall away beneath him. It was silent. The rain stopped and he could breathe for the first time since he was 4 years old. His eyes snapped open to stare at the horizon. Buildings highlighted in shadows that crawled painted a morbid, ghastly picture. But it was beautiful to him. His body twisted until he was spread out, arms and legs catching the air. A grin stole across his face. Gravity came back hard. His wings warbled, aching to stretch out and catch him, but he held off. He wanted to fall for just a bit longer. There was something exhilarating about the fall. It was almost hard to breathe with the wind rushing against him. Shadows streamed off of him like fog. It was only when he couldn't hold on any longer that he allowed his wings to open. They snapped open and instantly his fall halted. A sharp pain laced through his back, but it didn't stop the bright laughter that spilled from him. His body hung in the air. He angled his wings and tilted his body to the side. He tried to pump his wings only to plummet a few feet. The short fall shocked another laugh out of him. Maybe it was the adrenaline, but he wanted to get higher. He wanted to know what it'd feel like to fall from above the clouds. He tilted his head back, gazing through the rain at the black clouds. His grin was sharp as he tried to pump his wings again and again. He fell another few feet before he finally figured out how to go up. His wings folded around him, tips meeting, and then he was flying in short, awkward bursts upward. Far below, crimson feathers coalesced into brilliant wings. Golden eyes watched as a young boy sporadically flew off into the night. The hero huffed a soft laugh. Cutting it a bit close. Huh, kid? Chapter 11. Demonic Entrances. Summary. Izuku embraces his inner eldritch monstrosity. Notes. Extra long chapter. I had this chapter planned out when I began writing this, and I'm so excited. I tried making Izuku powerful but not too overpowered. At least not at first. Right now he's like the same as Todoroki. Trying to give him a realistic learning curve without nerfing him or making him into a Garisu is hard. Then again, canon Izuku is pretty Garisu. Chapter text. Izuku was practically vibrating. It would have been embarrassing if he'd been the same person he'd been a year ago. 10 months had passed quicker than he'd thought it would, and a lot in his life had changed. He took a deep, slow breath and tried to savor the moment. UA's massive main campus stood proud before him. He was excited. There was not an ounce of fear or nervousness inside him, just pure excitement. His tail swished gently behind him and his wings ached to stretch out. Just standing in front of the gates felt euphoric. He desperately wanted to get a bird's-eye view of the place, but he'd probably get kicked out if he did that. The path to the building was empty, but given the test didn't start for another hour, it wasn't really surprising. Izuku had been up half the night bouncing off the walls and driving Gorin out of their mind with his fanboy rambling. He'd left the house only barely past sunup so he could get the best seating for the test and not have to deal with people staring at him. He was admittedly far more confident than he'd been a year ago, but he still got uncomfortable with people staring at him. Thankfully, Gorin had explained that as partially being due to his new physiology. With his new shadowy nature, it was just plain unnatural for people to see him, and he'd taken to only going out at night. With all the different kinds of quirks, almost all stores were open 24/7 for the convenience of the nocturnal population. The diurnal and nocturnal scenes were completely different. Once the sun went down, the city was washed with blue and purple lights and the streets were flooded with all sorts of darker quirks and people. No one stared when he went out at night. There was an unspoken rule among the Nightwalkers. If you were out and you saw someone you didn't like or had a quirk you didn't like, then you kept your eyes forward and your mouth shut. The nocturnal community was far more reactive to discrimination. Izuku had witnessed a store clerk get utterly decimated after trying to kick a woman out for having a zombie quirk. Of course, Izuku himself had taken part in the public lesson on humility and morals. He hadn't seen that clerk again after that night, and he was only minorly shocked to find he didn't really care what happened to them. That said, the people he'd met over the past months were the nicest, most open-minded people he'd ever met. Gorin liked the nocturnal scene even more than Izuku did. The demon had mentioned how similar it was to their home and had guided Izuku on how to act and what places to avoid. His confidence had soared under the not-so-careful tutelage. He may have been difficult, completely reasonably in his opinion, but the rough teaching had done him more good than any encouragement ever had. Are you going to go in, or are you going to stand around like a dumbass? Izuku rolled his eyes with a small smile. Gorin had learned a lot about modern society and had grown quite fond of curses. They almost reminded him of Kakin, but better and occasionally formal and old-fashioned. Oh, fuck off. You're so impatient. With an excited smile and his head on a swivel, he walked through the massive gates. His tail twitched and wagged animatedly behind him. He was going to kill this test. The auditorium filled slowly as applicants filed in after their paper exam. Izuku sat in a section of seats closer to the stage, watching and cataloging the other students. His mind scanned through strengths and weaknesses to be exploited. Gorin had drilled him relentlessly on the importance of observation and being perceptive. As much as he loved the night scene, it was far more dangerous than the city was during the day. Being careless was for those that could back up their recklessness. Izuku was strong, but he wasn't experienced, and Gorin had thoroughly beaten battlefield strategy into his head. Strength didn't mean anything if you didn't have the skill to use it. The people around him were his opponent's enemies, and that meant they needed to be watched. He was one of the few students not wearing a uniform. Most, if not all, of the other applicants were decked out in various middle school uniforms. It made him feel a bit awkward in his worn tracksuit. He sat up straighter when President Mike walked onto the stage. "Good evening, listeners. Can I get a yeah?" Silence. Izuku cringed in secondhand embarrassment while Gorin cackled. Honestly, what did the guy expect? Trying to get a response out of teenagers on a good day was like pulling teeth. Izuku zoned out a bit as the hero explained the exam. He managed to catch something about robots, and from there it was easy enough to guess what he had to do. Destroy as many robots as possible. Easy. Don't get cocky. Arrogance will get you killed. Right, he whispered, hand covering his mouth so he wouldn't bother the people around him. Don't take the instructions too seriously. Most tests like this have a caveat. Sir, a couple rows down from his suddenly stood. The printout states a fourth enemy. If this is a mistake, it is unbefitting of UA to make such a careless error. And you, Izuku jumped slightly as the boy suddenly turned to him. If you are here to play around, leave. The hell is his problem? Izuku muttered, accidentally echoing Gorin. I was just getting to that. The fourth robot is just an obstacle. I suggest keeping clear of it. If you all look at your attendance cards, you'll see a letter. This is the exam arena you've been assigned. The buses outside are labeled for each. Before long, Izuku stood before a truly massive wall. Hundreds of people milled about, though most avoided him. Many sent distrustful or disdainful looks his way, but he'd long since learned how to ignore them. He stood directly in front of the gate, well away from the other contestants. His tail trailed the ground behind him as he stretched his wings out to their full size. 20 feet long and extremely well-muscled, they took up a lot of space. He internally grimaced at the thought of having to clean them after the exam. They'd been at the test site only a couple minutes, but he was already getting antsy. He wanted to move. Gorin had thoroughly corrupted him. He'd practically lived off adrenaline for the last year because of the demon's training. The closest he'd gotten to actually fighting had been shadow boxing. That is to say, literal shadow boxing. His shadows didn't count though. They didn't get hurt or dispel, and fighting them just got repetitive. This was new though. New opponents and situations and actual combat. Tension built inside him every second that went by. He wanted to fight, hunt, destroy. He should probably be a bit concerned with his desire for carnage, but he couldn't really bring himself to care. Gorin had told him he was born to fight. He hadn't really understood what the demon had meant by that until their first combat lesson. He was thoroughly addicted to the thrill of fighting. He'd wondered if that was how Kakin felt all the time and kind of understood why the boy was the way he was. He'd be hyper-aggressive too if he were always craving battle. A sharp buzz of electricity had his head tilting sharply to the side and his wings stilling. His wings rose above him as his muscles coiled tight. The gates rumbled as they slowly opened. His pupils dilated wide, taking in everything. His eyes locked into a robot in slow motion. Move. His wings surged, and within seconds he was upon his target. Predatory glee and anticipation tore through him. His talons sunk into the metal with a satisfying crunch. The robot crashed to the ground and he was airborne. Start. A grin stretched across his face, feral and sharp and hungry. This was so much better than shadow boxing, Izuku decided as he tore into another robot. He didn't bother counting points. The other examinees were far behind him. Scavenging from the trail of mayhem he left behind him. The world was silent and slow, almost like everything was moving in slow motion. His tail lashed out suddenly as the vibrations in the air changed. His body twisted, dodging a bright blue beam of light. A robot exploded behind him, and he spared a moment to wonder at the audacity of the blonde-haired twink who'd just stolen his kill. His head tilted in a distinctly cat-like manner as the twink suddenly paled at the sight of him before running off at a dead sprint. Izuku watched, still baffled even as his tail lashed out and impaled an approaching robot through the head. Oh well, there were plenty of robots to go around. He shrugged and turned back around. The feral energy inside him had petered out to be replaced by a cold predatory calculation. He stalked through the exam site, taking out any robot that crossed his path, but he found himself growing a bit bored of them. There was very little these robots could do to combat him, and after a while of destroying them, it just got a bit bland. He sent his shadows out for the first time during the exam. They swirled around him, impaling robots for him and shielding reckless examinees. Even through his predatory haze, his mind locked onto the distressed and injured. He was here to be a hero, and no matter how much he loved the thrill of combat, the weak and injured would always take precedence. Surprisingly, his demonic instincts actually helped. It was like a pull towards the more destroyed areas. He could hear them crying out in some weird ethereal way, and his heart just wouldn't let him walk by. His shadows engulfed examinee after examinee in protective bubbles. He had enough villain points to pass the test, probably. 5 minutes remaining. He stiffened suddenly as Gorin rose up. He could feel the demon's wariness and felt it bleed through to him. Something was wrong. A tremor rocked the ground and the remaining glass windows shattered. Several teens fell to the ground, staring in horror at the behemoth rising from the center of the city. Screams rang out as those still on their feet took off running. Izuku stood amidst the chaos, staring at the zero-pointer, screams echoing in his ears. His human and demonic instincts battled. The human wanted to run. The demon wanted to fight. His feet turned, body swaying. Ow! His heart seized in his chest. He turned, eyes wide. Time seemed to slow as the crowd parted just enough for him to see a girl, half her body trapped underneath a slab of concrete. Human and demonic instincts aligned in one singular moment. Unholy rage unfolded in his chest. His head throbbed in time with his heart. He stalked through the crowd, shadows crawling towards him. His wings and talons wouldn't be enough to down that thing. They crawled along the buildings, the roads, the sidewalks. The robot continued forward toward the terrified girl. The shadows swirled around the base of the zero-pointer like a whirlpool. A twinge ran through his head as he stepped around the girl, wings spreading wide to shield her. He rose his hand, black talons seemingly dripping shadow. The pain in his head grew and fire spread through his veins. Tendrils, small at first, rose from the whirlpool. The tendrils spiraled around each other, creeping up the robot's treads. He twisted his hand, fighting to concentrate around the growing pain behind his eyes. The whirlpool began twisting, black limbs rising. Far larger than the tendrils, the tentacles wrapped around the zero-pointer's legs, then its arms. More and more rose to wrap around the robot's body and head. Metal clanged and creaked as the tentacles began dragging it down into the shadows. Sweat poured into Izuku's eyes as he fought to keep his hold of the shadows. Little tendrils crawled up his legs. His tail whipped behind him. Down, the tentacles dragged the creaking robot. The shadows bubbled and roiled like turbulent tides as the last of the zero-pointer's head disappeared. Slowly, Izuku opened his hand and dropped his control. The shadows dispersed with excited eldritch whispers. The boy turned, green and gold eyes meeting the girls. "Are you okay?" Chapter 12. Teenagers Scare the Living Shit Out Me. Summary. The UA staff is thoroughly unprepared for Izuku. Notes. I was convinced to write another chapter. I'm going to be laying it on thick with the demon jokes from here on out. I thought about putting Izuku in 1B just for his interactions with Shiozaki, but I don't know 1B well enough to make them the main characters. Grammarly kept trying to correct Kuin to run, so let me know if you see any mistakes. Chapter text. The silence was loud. The observation room for UA's annual entrance exam was usually filled with comments and boisterous excitement and anticipation. All the teachers liked watching the practical entrance exams for the support and hero courses. It was a chance to get their first look at their potential students. The support exam had been eventful. Aizawa almost pitted Myhejima, almost being the operative word. Hatsum was going to drive the other man insane and Shoyuta was going to enjoy watching. His good mood was quickly soured by the hero course exam. The hero exam had shot the support exam to pieces and buried the remains. What the fuck did I just watch? No, really, what the actual fuck had he just watched? The day had started out so well too. He got to enjoy Myhejima's suffering during the support exam and took a good 3-hour nap. 3 hours. How had the day come to this? Why him? He shared a glance with Vlad before looking at Nizu. The creature, none of the staff knew what he was and were too afraid to ask, grinned up at the screen with something lurking in his eyes. Aizawa looked away, focusing instead on the screen. Ladies, gentlemen, and others, I present our first-place examinee, Midoriya Izuku. Quirk, unnamed. A heteromorphic dual quirk that gives the user immense control over shadows. He scowled at the description. The screen displayed several of the kid's takedowns. Control of shadows was too vague a descriptor. The kid had ripped into the villain bots like they were made of tissue paper instead of solid steel. Strength enhancement? His eyes narrowed as he watched the boy impale a bot with his tail. No, not a strength enhancer. He'd have to look over the kid's file himself to get a good idea of his quirk. Aizawa, I'll be placing him in your homeroom. Vlad sat up straighter. Now hold on a minute. Midoriya's quirk would work well with the recommendation students in 1B better than 1A. He's got a versatile quirk, so I'd be more suited to teaching him. Shoyuta had to admit it was more logical to put Midoriya in 1B if you only took his quirk into consideration. Vlad wasn't one for large observations, though. He could think of several reasons Midoriya would be better off in 1A, but he wanted to know what the rat thought. The mammal, at least they were pretty sure he was a mammal, grinned as he sipped his tea, pulling up another file. Bakugo Katsuki quirk. Explosion. Bakugo and Midoriya have a history and a legal contract in place. Bakugo is not to be within 10 meters of Midoriya. Due to this, I've decided to put him in 1B. His score hasn't been tallied yet. 13 spoke up from the corner of the room. Shoyuta was surprised 13 hadn't already left to help on the fields. I didn't see him help a single person. Yeah, he'd noticed that too. The Bakugo kid had been reckless and violent. Not untrainable, but the kid would have to get some semblance of control. He had potential and great battle instincts. He passed the cutoff. I'd wager perhaps second place. Regardless, Bakugo and Midoriya are not to interact without the supervision of a teacher, if at all. Nizu took another sip of his tea, eyeing the files with thinly veiled amusement and curiosity. Should his eyes narrowed on the files, why let Bakugo in if he has a restraining order against him? Nizu hummed, and a video of Midoriya taking down the zero-pointer began to play. A chill crawled down Shuta's spine. Those shadows weren't normal, not even by Quirk standards. He'd operated in the underground long enough to tell the difference between a shadow Quirk and whatever the fuck Midoriya had going on. Whatever happened between the boys was handled privately, and no charges were officially pressed. From a legal standpoint, Bakugo's record is clean. Although the agreement may seem like a standard restraining order, it's actually just a contractual agreement made between the parents. We'll still be following it, of course. It'd be reckless to disregard it. Bakugo's quirk is already extremely powerful, and the listener is good with it. He'd be a good match with Shiozaki. His explosions would go well with her vines or Hananuki's softening. Offense, defense, and containment. They'd be a good team. Mike spoke up from beside him. Mixed strategic planning and intelligence had long since stopped surprising him. Sometimes he just didn't understand how everyone didn't fear the blonde. Mike was way scarier than him. He was just better at hiding his own sadistic tendencies. Shoyuta didn't bother hiding his. That'd be way too much work. So I'll have to deal with Midoriya, and Vlad gets expelled a boy. Wonder which of us will turn to alcoholism first. Snipe huffed a laugh, but what really caught his attention was the sudden jerk Yagi gave. The man had been unusually quiet since the situation in Arena B. Honestly, Shoyuta hadn't thought the man was capable of being quiet. But it can't be. Something wrong, Yagi? Mike, ever the extrovert, asked. Yagi sat up straighter, suddenly tense and nervous with the attention of the room. How this squirrel of a man was All Might he didn't know. Yagi and All Might were so completely different it was jarring. Midnight had a hero persona too, but this was just ridiculous, or maybe that was Shuta's own bias talking. His dislike of All Might was well known. Most underground heroes had at least a little dislike for the man. All Might was the exact opposite of every underground hero, and being the strongest hero just garnered their suspicion. All heroes were paranoid, but underground heroes took it to another level. They were used to watching their backs and being wary of everything and everyone. All Might's ability to somehow disappear from the radar had caused all of them to watch the man. All Might was dangerous, and if he went rouge, Shoyuta and just about every other hero with a nullification quirk would be the first line of defense. That boy Midoriya, he's quirkless, or he was a year ago. The man's face was deathly pale, even paler than it usually was. Shuta's eyes narrowed in confusion. Quirk science was one of his interests. He'd always been interested in the activation and genetic aspects of quirks. A quirk activating late in life wasn't unheard of. But at 14? That was weird, more than weird. There'd been cases of quirks having special activations, but if the kid had been labeled quirkless instead of hidden, that meant there was something else going on. Worry not, All Might. Midoriya's activation was thoroughly investigated. That was good at least. Meant it wasn't a trauma activation. Midoriya reported his quirk immediately and was seen by specialists from all over Japan due to the specifics of his quirk. Specifics? His quirk is evolving almost constantly. There are signs that it may mutate even more drastically. Who knows what his limits may be? What can he do? Shoyuta asked suddenly. Dread grew in his chest. He'd have to teach a kid who'd constantly be adapting to his own quirk. If a quirk as powerful as Midoriya's suddenly lost control, the school and everyone in it would be in danger. Midoriya's been consistently reporting changes and new abilities over the past year. What we have so far is shadow manipulation, night vision, vibration sensitivity, and awareness, for lack of a better word, through his shadows. He can feel through them. That's not mentioning his physical changes. Truly fascinating. I look forward to meeting him. Shoyuta felt a wave of sympathy wash through him. Poor kid got Nizu's attention. God help him. Down in the arena, a strong shudder ran up Izuku's spine. A wave of foreboding had him wrapping his wings around himself. What was that? I feel like we've been cursed, but I don't sense anything. Weird. Who are you talking to? Izuku looked back at the girl and laughed nervously. Chapter 13, Neum. Summary. Izuku runs from social interaction. Notes. All Might is surprisingly hard to write. I relate to Aizawa on deep personal level. I too wish I could sleep all day. Chapter text. The week passed agonizingly slowly. Izuku had practically run away from the girl he'd saved once Recovery Girl arrived. Trying to explain that he was talking to his Quirk would have been awkward, way more awkward than him running away. He'd spent the week alternating between panicking, texting Jiro, and staring aimlessly at his ceiling. Logically, he knew he wouldn't fail the practical exam. He'd destroyed a lot of robots, but then he'd let his shadows eat the zero-pointer. Was he going to have points taken away for that? He couldn't remember President Mike saying anything against destroying it, but he hadn't really been listening. Then there was the written exam. He'd agonized over the questions he couldn't remember the answers to, frantically searching the answers on his phone after the exam. He was going to fail. He knew it. He could feel it in his bones. Jiro had called him dramatic and spent almost an hour ranting about the hellish study sessions he'd put her through. He knew he shouldn't be so worried about it, but he couldn't help it. This test would decide his entire future. He and his mom had stress cleaned the apartment 3 times in the last 2 days alone and baked 5 batches of cookies. Goran didn't understand his stress either. The demon was completely certain he'd passed the exams and would not allow any negative commentary regarding it. His door suddenly slammed open. Izuku startled like a cat, jumping half a foot into the air with his tail ramrod straight. His mother stood in the doorway, eyes wide and trembling, a letter clutched in her hand. "It's here. Izuku, your letter." She folded against the doorframe and shakily held out the envelope. He took the letter just as shakily. He stared with dread at the UA crest. He wanted to open it, but he also didn't. If he opened it, that meant he failed. But if he just left it closed, then he wouldn't have to face his failure. Schrodinger's letter. "I'm gonna open it alone. Is that okay?" He looked at his mom helplessly, his anxiety clear. Inko gave him a small smile and nodded before closing the door. He let out a deep breath and plopped down heavily in his desk chair. This was it. His future was in his hands. "Just open it already, you wimp." Izuku huffed at his partner before gripping the envelope in his hands. He stared at it for a long moment, trying to battle his nerves back, and with a determined frown, he ripped it open. "What the hell was that?" "I just opened it like you said," Izuku said with clear offense. "You ripped it in half, you heathen." Izuku rolled his eyes at the demon's nitpicking. A metal disc dropped onto his desk, leaving the envelope empty and Izuku extremely confused. He picked the disc up, turning it this way and that as he tried to figure out what it was. His fingers slid over a button and a light flashed from the disc. "Midoriya Izuku." Izuku shrieked so loudly his ears rang. The disc dropped out of his hands and clanked against the floor. A hologram of All Might stood tall in his room. All Might was in his room. The message being pre-recorded did not stop him from feeling embarrassed for the hero shrine that was his room. "I am here. As a recording. You scored a remarkable 94% on the written exam. Incredible work, young man. But what was truly impressive was your practical exam. You scored a solid 82 villain points, more than enough to qualify for the hero course. But that's not all. What kind of hero school would we be if we overlooked heroic actions? A secondary scoring system is used for the hero exams. Rescue points. The very essence of being a hero is saving people, and you, Midoriya Izuku, were awarded 64 rescue points for your brave actions during the exam. Congratulations, this is your hero academia. I swear if you cry." Too late. Big fat tears rolled down his cheeks. He passed. He was going to be an actual hero. He stood in front of the massive door, practically quivering in place. Why was this so hard? Damn anxiety. It was just a door. All he had to do was open it, find his seat, and not talk to anyone. He reached out, hands shaking, and slammed the door open. All conversation stopped. 13 pairs of eyes locked onto him. Shit, 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 shit. Abort mission. You're pathetic. His spine snapped straight and his legs moved almost robotically. He adamantly ignored the other students staring at him and Jiro's amused smile as he took his seat in the back of the room. The moment he sat down on the backless chair, he slammed his face into the desk. Kill him now. Put him out of his misery. Midoriya, what the hell was that? Please leave me to suffer, Jiro. He groaned into the wood, body limp. She laughed unrepentantly at him. He glanced up from his sulking and pouted at her. His misery was not funny. Thank you very much, and his friend's teasing was unappreciated. The girl leaned forward, placing her elbows on the desk, still chuckling. Izuku's eyes swept the room, cataloging the vents, doors, and windows. He studiously ignored the students still staring at him. You excited? It's you. A bright, excited voice had his head jerking up and his face rapidly paling. There, stalking down the aisle, was the girl from the entrance exam. Izuku tilted his head back to stare despondently at the ceiling. Some deity hated him. He just knew it. There was no way his luck was this bad, right? You ran away from me. Oh God, please no. Gorin cackled. What did he do to deserve this? Now everyone was staring again. Jiro had a hand over her mouth, eyes crinkled in glee. His face flamed red and his wings came around to hide him. Just as the girl was about to speak up again, another voice cut through the room. Longer than a minute. The voice was strained with a deep exhaustion that came from long nights and even longer days. It was laced with a certain kind of defeatedness that had Izuku looking up on instinct. His eyes locked onto a man hidden in the shadow of the door, and he absently wondered when he'd gotten there. He's been there since the girl came in. Izuku internally groaned. It would have been helpful if his shadows or Gorin had said something, but no. His shadows still only spoke in an indistinct eldritch language. He couldn't understand, and Gorin liked to see him suffer. That's not going to work. I'm Aizawa Shoyuta 1 as homeroom teacher. He glared tiredly at them as he threw a box of uniforms on the teacher's podium. Put those on and meet me at field beta in 10 minutes. If you're late, you're expelled. Then he walked out. There was a long moment of silent shock before the class burst into movement. Izuku took the opportunity to escape the awkward situation. The boys' locker room was instantly filled with chatter. Izuku watched his classmates, not partaking in any conversations, but not ignoring them either. He watched as a small, bony boy with odd purple balls on his head stealthily hid in a bathroom stall. A surge of something he was unfamiliar with rose in him. It was an electrifying feeling that filled him with the need to move. He kept an eye on the stall as he changed into his own uniform. What's going on, Gorin? He whispered under his breath. Keep an eye on him. He could feel the demon's suspicion in his head, but his partner didn't continue. He shrugged but resolved to watch out for the smaller boy. Izuku huffed and turned to head out onto the field, only to find a bird-headed boy staring at him unervingly with crimson eyes. Another in league with the dark. He heard the boy say just as he walked past him. A shudder ran down his spine. What the hell was up with his new class? His tail twitched agitatedly behind him. The walk to the field only took him a couple minutes. Jiro joined him on the walk there with a couple other girls. Luckily not the girl from the exam. Aizawa-sensei stood on the field, looking more like he'd rather be sleeping than anywhere near teenagers. He looked over at the small crowd dismissively. It only took a couple minutes for the rest of the class to arrive, and Izuku found himself searching for the purple boy on instinct. The boy was leering at the girls, and Izuku's lip began to curl in a snarl before he noticed the look in the boy's eyes. There was something desolate in the boy's dark purple eyes, and an air of something sour wafted off of him every time he glanced at one of the girls. Something was wrong there. He could taste it. He listened with half an ear as Aizawa-sensei went through the instructions for the quirk assessment. He only managed to drag his eyes away from the purple boy when the teacher called his name. His head snapped over to the hero, green-gold eyes staring with an unearthly intensity. You got first in the practical exam. What was your score for the ball throw in middle school? Izuku blinked, set off-center. I was homeschooled, sensei. Aizawa-sensei's eyebrow twitched and Izuku shuffled his feet awkwardly. He wasn't used to having an adult's attention solely focused on him, and he found himself both reveling in it and dreading it. All right then, try it with your quirk. Just stay in the circle. It was said with a tired sort of acceptance. He almost felt sorry for the teacher as he took the ball and made his way to the circle. He tossed the ball from hand to hand, thinking. Gorin didn't give him any supernatural strength, so just throwing the ball wouldn't get him a very good score. Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes. He couldn't use his wings, so he'd have to use his shadows. A cold calm washed over his mind, chasing away his anxiety. The shadows came to him excitedly, writhing at his feet. A thin tendril rose from the crowd at his feet, wrapping around the ball. Izuku let his hand drop from the ball but kept his eyes closed. He'd need his concentration for this. Slowly, the tendril lifted the ball high. It rose into the sky until his control of the tendril wavered. He paused and took another tightly controlled breath. The shadows at his feet rose with every breath. He drew the tendril tight like a rubber band and then snapped it. A high-pitched neum followed as the ball streaked across the sky far into the distance. Izuku let out a shaky breath as he opened his eyes. Sure, it wasn't the flashiest, but he'd just essentially slingshot the ball from at least a mile high. A beep came from Aizawa-sensei. 932.7 meters. Chapter 14, Screaming Souls. Summary. Gorin observes their dealer's class and finds some concerning things. Notes. TW, references to trauma and Mineta. It's not in depth, but it could still trigger some. I have quite a lot of experience with different kinds of trauma, and I tend to write those kinds of scenes with my memories in mind. I'm giving Mineta a backstory that fits his character, but I'm also going to make him a good person. People deal with trauma differently, and some become hypersexual due to their trauma in an attempt to deal with the things they went through. In this case, Mineta uses his sexuality as a shield from his trauma. Stay safe and keep your mental health in mind. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. Almost a year had passed since they'd made the contract with the boy. Those long 10 months had been filled with back-to-back surprises and Gorin was living for it. They hadn't had this much fun in millennia. The child's body was admittedly a bit weak, but it was adaptable. It was his mind and soul that were truly fascinating, however. Izuku had such potential. His mind was analytical, deductive, and just all-around odd. The child's soul was similarly odd. It was light with a haunting shade of purple lurking at the edges. Instead of tainting the boy's light, the purple only made it brighter. This in itself wasn't too odd. Most individuals with savior complexes tended to have that phenomenon. One didn't simply develop such a mindset without suffering. The oddity with Izuku's soul was how that corruption pulsed in certain situations. It pulsed, spreading into the light, like ink in water, and it only ever did it when the boy's complex started acting up. How curious that a child could foster such hate even, especially when saving others. The child's soul was flavored with a tangy sweetness that washed over their senses up until he saw another in danger. Then spice would flood the usual sweet flavor. A fruity taste tempered by cinnamon and clove. It was like nothing they'd tasted before. It was exotic. Then again, nearly everything was in this new world they'd found themselves in. The human race had progressed so far in the few thousand years they'd been away. With the evolution of humanity, their flavors had changed a degree. It was unfortunate they hadn't been able to try any of the new flavors they'd come across. But that would change soon. For all their dealer was light, the child held a degree of cruelty in his heart. His intelligence made him cunning and wily, though the boy didn't like to acknowledge it. He had the heart of a predator hidden deep beneath layers of social conditioning. Goran snorted in amusement as Izuku used his wings to boost himself in the 50-meter dash. Honestly, that boy, so young and so inexperienced. He'd come a long way in the few months they'd trained together, but he still had years to go before he could use his abilities to their full potential. Their attention roved over the class as the tests progressed. Oh, how they loved this new age. The warriors of Greece had all been jaded and twisted. Those soldiers were brought to the battlefield by a desire for vengeance or duty. They had none of the nobility of the children of this time. Their souls shone brightly with their own desires, though each had their own taint, just as Izuku did. They eyed the child with engines for calves with curiosity. That one soul had a grayish tint to it. A faint taste of licorice wafted from him. That one had an edge to him, an edge that was hidden desperately behind a veneer of righteousness. Their gaze strayed from the boy to another student. The girl their dealer was trying to avoid caught their attention. Her soul carried far less of a taint than the others in the class. It had a faint taste that fizzled and popped, but it also carried a song. It was a light, fast beat, and they found themselves bobbing their head to the sound. It matched her bubbly personality and her tenacity. She had a similar determination as Izuku. They snickered as the girl tried to talk to Izuku again, only to have the boy bolt to the next test with a squeak. Then there was the purple boy. They winced at the child's soul. It was a cloudy, sickly white, a dark, insidious infection. The boy watched the girls with almost a leer. Well, what would look like a leer to anyone that couldn't sense the child's emotions and see his soul. Every time the boy looked at one of the girls, a film came over his eyes and his emotions became muted. It was concerning, to say the least. He radiated suffering. The boy's soul screamed out into the void, attention-grabbing for any demon. And the cries were all too familiar. They'd first heard them in the locker room. It had been what caused them to warn Izuku, though their dealer had already catoned on to something being wrong. They closed their eyes and turned their head away as they listened to the tortured cries. "Stop it. Let her go. Let her go, you bastard. I'll do anything. Just please stop hurting her. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mom. What kind of son am I if I can't even protect my own mom?" They were glad Izuku couldn't hear the souls yet. The boy would have done something reckless otherwise. Nevertheless, something would need to be done about the situation. They thoroughly anticipated consuming the soul of the boy's tormentor, and Izuku would be able to help heal the boy. They sighed and felt Izuku's attention turn to them before they waved the boy off. Honestly, that child was too attentive. They forced themselves to turn their attention away from the screaming soul and back to the rest of the class. It was just their luck that the class had another with a similarly screaming soul. Though this one screamed with wordless rage and seething hate. It was honestly impressive, but they'd need to deal with that one as well. So much work to do, not that they minded overly much. They'd get 2, potentially more, corrupted souls to eat after the children were saved. The boy with red and white hair had been watching Izuku unervingly close as the tests progressed and Izuku rose up the rankings. This boy's face was curiously blank despite his raging soul, though his eyes sparked with challenge every time Izuku surpassed his score. Without a doubt, Izuku's chosen carrier would be infinitely interesting. It was already shaping up to be absolutely riveting. They turned to observe the next student only to meet an inhumanly gold gaze. Now, if only the Tengu could mind its own fucking business. Notes. You could probably guess by the note at the beginning, but psychology is one of my special interests. The human mind is just utterly fascinating. I probably won't be able to update next week, though, 'cause I'll be moving into my dorm and figuring out my classes. I'll probably try to update again this weekend to make up for it, but no promises. Chapter 15, High Bridges and Sapphire Cities. Summary. Japan is beautiful at night. Notes. TW, allusion to suicidal ideation. I'm back. School's a hassle, and I'm already failing chemistry, so why not ignore my homework and write a chapter? Chapter text. Izuku was infinitely glad Aizawa-sensei put the endurance race last. His body absolutely ached. His wings sagged at his sides, and his tail dragged along the ground. A thick layer of sweat dripped off of him. He'd done well in all of the tests, though his abilities weren't always of use. There really wasn't much he could use his shadows for, but his wings picked up the slack. He'd scored in the top 5 of each test except for the sidesteps and grip strength, so he was pretty confident he'd pass. The cool confidence in his own abilities helped soothe his raging anxiety. It was a wonder he'd managed to keep his cool throughout the tests. The purple boy, Mineta Minoru, kept setting off his instincts. It would have been nice if he could actually understand what those instincts were trying to point out to him. Otherwise, it just kept distracting him. Gorin had been projecting a mix of irritation, curiosity, and amusement the entire time. Thankfully, the year they'd spent together had accustomed Izuku to the random surge of foreign emotions. That didn't stop him from getting curious, though. He stretched beside the track as they waited for the moped girl to finish. He already knew he was going to rank behind her. Honestly, the versatility of her quirk was astounding. She'd managed to find something for every test and had so far gotten in the top 3 of each one. He almost felt jealous. What would it be like to have that kind of power and not have it come attached to an asshole? He couldn't help but sigh for the opportunity lost. Gorin grumbled in annoyance. "You okay?" He tilted his head to the side, revealing at the cracking sound it made. Jiro winced from beside him. "Yeah, I'm not used to that kind of flying yet. I'll get better," he said with the utmost confidence. The tests had washed away the majority of his anxiety, and he knew with absolute certainty that he'd get better. 10 months ago he'd been quirkless and weak, and now, well, he was still quirkless, but he wasn't powerless. Jiro hummed in agreement with a nod, her eyes skirting over his drooping wings. The appendages twitched under her gaze but stayed in their relaxed pose. Jiro was always curious about his quirk, and while part of him was ecstatic, the other was absolutely terrified. The chance of someone figuring out what he'd done was low, practically in the negatives, but there was still a chance. It didn't take much longer for Moped Girl to run out of gas and for the tests to come to an end. The class waited in anxious anticipation as Aizawa-sensei fiddled on his phone. Izuku was pretty sure the man was just fucking with them. A hologram popped up in front of the teacher, names and ranks displayed. Izuku smiled, rolled his shoulders, and leaned back on his heels. His name sat firmly in 3rd place just behind Todoroki Shoto. Jiro snorted at him as his tail bounced happily. Her own name was placed at 17th. Low, but given she couldn't actually use her quirk without support gear, she placed pretty well. Mineta's name sat in the last spot. The boy himself stared at the rankings with an unnaturally blank face, his eyes wide and cloudy. Izuku's heart twisted in his chest. A pressure built in his head, right behind his eyes, and he found himself blinking spots out of his vision. "Mineta, you're expelled." For a moment it was like the world stopped. Izuku tasted iron. Something was wrong. He didn't know what, but he knew this wasn't normal. The pressure in his head weighed him down as he watched in numb shock as Mineta silently walked to the main office. Unconsciously, he took a stumbling step forward. Jiro dragged him back, guiding him into the building and to the changing rooms. He changed in a dissociative haze. Red eyes met his on his way out of the changing room. The bird-headed boy, Tokoyami, met his gaze steadily. A sort of understanding lurked in the other boy's eyes. Izuku felt like a puppet as he gave Tokoyami a silent nod and stumbled his way out of the building. Jiro met up with him in front of the school entrance. They walked silently side by side until the girl from earlier caught up with them, followed by the tall rule-obsessed boy. He only barely caught their names, the world still so far away. He looked up briefly when a large hand clapped down on his shoulder. Ida was talking and bowing, hands moving as he spoke, but Izuku didn't hear a thing. A harsh, high-pitched ringing pierced through the fog in his mind. Behind Ida was a hunched-over figure, trudging out of the school gates, head bowed. The pressure behind his eyes exploded, and the world went white. A small pedestrian bridge overlooked a highway. It was dark, the sun only just beginning to fall, but Japan never slept. Bright blue and purple lights lit up the streets as the night dwellers began their day. Cars raced down below the bridge, red and white lights standing out sharply against the twilight colors. It was too early or late for some, for there to be anyone on the bridge. This area of Mizudafu didn't get much traffic, too poor to afford anything for tourists or heroes. The paint on the bridge was peeled and stained with graffiti that had been there longer than he'd been alive. His hand trailed along the tall railing alongside the bridge. His fingers brushed old pairs of shoes tied to the bars and small locks. The blue lights made the bridge look better than it did during the day, almost romantic in a way. Not a bad place, all things considered. He dropped his bag. The climb to the top wasn't hard. He sat on the railing for a while. He didn't know how long, just absorbing the sight. Japan was beautiful at night for all that it was more dangerous. The city sparkled with blues and purples, such a stark contrast to the golds and reds of the day. A small, genuine smile grew on his face even as tears silently began falling from his eyes. It was beautiful. Midoriya. Izuku choked on his own breath as his knees hit the ground. His hands grasped at his chest as surges of nostalgia and resignation pulsed through him. The air smelt like brimstone and ash as he forced himself to take in breath after breath. He clawed at the concrete and staggered to his feet, ignoring the gouges he left in the sidewalk. The world snapped into sharp focus. What the hell was that? He listed to the side as he struggled to walk. Hands tried to grab onto him, but he brushed them off easily. He needed to move. His shadows writhed at his feet, lashing out at the hands grasping at him. He started forward with a single-minded focus. This was important. He had to do something. That, whatever it was a warning or something. His heart pulled him through the streets into the subway. He shouldered past people with increasing urgency, not caring or noticing the hateful sneers cast his way. He stalked through the crowds and bought a ticket for a train going in the opposite direction of his apartment. There was something he had to do, someone he had to go to. His heart twisted and squeezed in his chest. Sundown wasn't for at least 4 hours. He could find the bridge by then. He scoured the train, looking, searching. The people around him grew tense every time he stalked back down the car. But he couldn't care less. He had things to do, classmates to find. If they wanted to record him pacing the length of a train car for their own peace of mind, then so be it. He practically bolted out the doors the moment they opened. He bullied his way out of the subway and out into the city. East Mizudafu was starkly different from the rest of the city. The streets were crowded with trash, and many of the buildings were crumbling ruins. The air tasted sickly sweet and left his mind misty. Gorin was far more alert than Izuku was. The demon took note of every person, ally, or building they passed in Izuku's quest. Instinct drove Izuku deeper and deeper into the underbelly of the city. He locked onto every suffering soul, sending him down alleyways populated by the homeless and addicts. He paused outside of apartment complexes with his heart and mind screaming for him to help. He snarled when a group of men blocked him at the end of an alley. Fangs bared and mind driven feral with the need to find the person calling him. He could smell the suffering, taste it on his tongue, and maybe another time he would have taken the time to savor the sweetness of corruption. But he was busy. There wasn't much time left. The men backed off quickly after he flashed his teeth in an animalistic display of aggression. He wasn't someone to fuck with, least of all by the pathetic waste keeping him from what was his. He prowled through the streets, even as the lights began to turn on. The night dwellers took one look at him and got out of his way. More than a few bowed their heads to him, though he took no notice. There was a tugging in his chest driving him further into the city, leading him to the even more rundown parts. He crossed 3 separate bridges, each one populated. It was only as the night scene was really starting up that he found the one he was searching for. He stalked out of the rundown neighborhood he'd been led to, eyes glued to the tiny figure sitting on top of the railing. He didn't bother being gentle about it, far too consumed by his instinctual worry. His shadows lashed out, whipping forward with vicious ferocity. A tendril wrapped around Mineta's waist and flung the boy off the railing and back onto the bridge. The boy bounced off the ground with a yelp. Izuku's hand snapped forward, grasping a hold of the other's uniform, and lifted Mineta bodily off the ground. Nose to nose with the boy, Izuku snarled, "Just what the hell do you think you're doing?"